Hey everybody, Johnny Bigot here. Alright, this is part 3 of the Vollrath family tree life story. The last time I said that about 3 weeks ago, I think it was. Even longer. I said that my dad's mom and him were not very close. And his father died before anybody else, leaving the whole wealth to my grandmother, and which was bad luck for my dad because, as I mentioned, they were not close at all. There seems to be some kind of a favoritism as far as the percentage of wealth that goes to which child, which kid. As my dad described it, it was very unfair. As I also mentioned that my uncle, I think, he was able to access his money by a certain age. For example, at the age of 25. Unfortunately for him, from what I have learned, he pretty much blew it all away, traveling the world, living it up. And my dad was living on a trust fund that belonged to his mother, my grandmother, which he had no access to the trust. The only rights he had was a certain percentage of the interest that made every month or every quarter or whatever, how that goes. And it was heavily invested in many taxes, or not taxes, but stock market. So unfortunately for my dad, he could not really do much with it because it was never enough to start something. But at the same time, it was somewhat of a blessing to him because my dad was not very frugal with money. He didn't buy fancy clothes, fancy cars, or jewelry, but he liked to buy his toys. So that was a curse and a blessing for him. And I also mentioned that at the time of my dad's passing, that trust that belonged to my grandmother was the sole property to my uncle, my dad's brother. So the day my dad died, my brother inherited somewhere around $30 million of a trust, which he had sole property and ownership of it. And no, the trust did not trickle down to my dad's children. The only inheritance that my brother and I and my sister got was, well, we were able to sell the house, sell certain things, and the properties, cars. And my dad also had a certain amount of cash in his bank account, but that was it. 100% of the trust was the sole ownership of my uncle, and the trust became no longer a trust. The day my dad died, the trust was dissolved and turned into cash. which my uncle inherited it. So yeah, you should have seen the look on his face when my dad died. I don't know whether he wanted to cry or he wanted to scream, I'm rich, I'm rich. So, and my uncle and I and my family are not that close either. So that was about the last time we saw him. I tried to get a hold of him a few times just to say hello, but it kind of felt a little bit dirty because, you know, the expectation is, what do you want? You know? And I didn't want that. But I miss him. He's my closest to a relative, you know, for my dad's side. I got to contact him one time and I asked him if he wanted to continue in contact, but he said yes. But I tried doing that again and no response, so I let it go. Alright, so back in the Philippines, as I mentioned also that my dad befriended a Filipino family, which I don't know whether how big of an impact my dad contributed to these family before. At the beginning they were, you know, normal Filipinos, but they soon opened up a machine shop and a welding shop and the kind of stuff that my dad was very familiar with. So I don't know whether my dad influenced that or not. But the Paras family became a very prominent family, a very wealthy family, successful family in Cagayan de Oro City. And they also opened up a construction company, building roads, building buildings, projects, and they were pretty big. So as I said, I don't know how much influence my dad had with them, but I know that the Paras family had the biggest influence towards my dad. Basically, my dad learned the family traditions and culture and the don'ts and the yes and the no's, the etiquettes and all that stuff. And my dad always appreciated that. He also respected the older guy, Papa Bear we called him. And Papa Bear had about 10 children, I think. And the eldest, LP, became my dad's closest best friend and non-related brother. And they were very close. In fact, and many years later, when Papa Bear died, my dad contributed to, you know, the family grief and all that stuff. You know how you give money away? Kind of like that. I don't know. I heard it was like $10,000, which is pretty big in the Philippine money. LP is a very he's one of those guys that can anything he puts his mind to will click and be hot as gold and hotcakes. Any business he ever touched or tried, it turns into a gold mine. Alright, so I'm trying to tell you this in a chronological order, and I'm trying not to jump too much of it, but something I also mentioned that I went to school in the island, and it wasn't the best of school, I tell you that. As you can see the result. But I had a very good childhood. I lived in a very modern house, modern family, indoor plumbing, hot water, hot showers, and electricity and all that stuff. Half of the barrio was employed by my dad and my mom. My mom was a very influential figure in the barrio. And I grew up in a village as one of the kids. My best friend is from the barrio. Went to school with them, played with them. Sometimes I would invite them to my house. And you know, it's mind-boggling that these kids would go to my house and they would you could almost look at like they're entering a palace because it is so different from what they've got. The amazement and the awe that you can see on the expression on their faces, it is really to behold. Anyway, forward about 1979 or 80. By then, my mom and my dad divorced. It was a very traumatic, painful memory. My dad fell in love with another woman, had a child with her, and that became my half sister, Elizabeth. So naturally everything fell apart. My dad's project to the swamp, which he turned into somewhat of he was building it as a resort. People from around the world would flock in our house to stay there, even though it wasn't even open for business. And you have to realize that how significant that is, that back then, without internet, our house became worldwide known by just the word of mouth from the travels of people that stayed in our house from around the world. Sometimes I would have to give up my bed just so these guys could sleep there, you know. So I don't know, my dad called it quits. He was hurt. He had permission from my mom to let me and my brother go with him. We left the Philippines. Oh, I forgot, I gotta back up a little bit. Several years before we left the Philippines, there were two guys that were from Western Samoa, and they were sons of what do you call those? Samoa practices kings and royalties and just chief and all that stuff, just like the Native Americans, Indians did. And they were sent to the Philippines to study agriculture. The first guy, his name was Ken what was his last name? Ken Lameta. And the other one was, oh boy, I forgot his name. But they were royalty to the island of Western Samoa. And they studied in the University of Xavier in Cagayan City. And for some reason, my dad befriended them, and they would frequently visit and became friends with my dad. And so my dad I don't know why. I think I have some ideas, but it was some really weird way of the way the story unfolded, because any U.S. citizen person would have a child anywhere in the world, and that child is considered an American. That's the way the U.S. immigration is written. No matter where in the world, if you have a child there by a local person, all you got to do is claim that child, go to the U.S. Embassy, claim that child, and get him a U.S. passport within 4 hours. That's the way it should be. Now, for some reason, I don't know why, my dad could not do that to me and my brother. I think because my brother and I, our birth certificate was not properly rendered. It was, I don't know, wrong spelling. The father of the child was not written on the birth certificate. So by the time my dad decided to leave the Philippines and come to America, we did not have a visa. So my dad kind of played around with the idea of going to Western Samoa just to stay there for a while with Ken and Savala. Savala, I think it was. So from Manila to Hawaii is a stopover on the way to Samoa. And if you remember back in the 1980s somewhere, you could probably Google this, Pan Am had a really big airstrike. And so we were forced to, well, we were going to land in Hawaii, but since there was no flight going in and out, the U.S. immigration had to issue us a tourist visa, which was great news. And my dad was somewhat of an expert as far as immigration laws, because he himself was a seafarer, a sailor, a merchant marine, a civilian sailor. And as promised, he continued, we continued to Western Samoa, stayed there for I don't know how long. I remember going into the caves and the ocean caves and all that stuff. I remember taking pictures using a Polaroid. Remember those Polaroid things? But anyway, so the vacation in Western Samoa served its purpose. We went back to Hawaii and we started taking our journey back to Sheboygan, Wisconsin. That was the first time I have ever seen a Lake Michigan. And no matter how much my dad would explain that Lake Michigan is a lake and not an ocean, me and my brother could not conceive of the idea what a lake was. All we knew was rivers and oceans. We didn't have a lake in the island. So we started living in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. I remember going to the 7th grade. What grade is that? I mean, what age is 7th grade? When I left the Philippines, I was a first year high school. When I was enrolled in Farnsworth, Sheboygan, Wisconsin, I was a 7th grade. And I studied 7th grade, 8th grade, and a few months of freshman in South High High School in Sheboygan. Just to tell you a little bit of what my dad's character is, the first winter that me and my family arrived in Sheboygan there, or experienced, instead of going to the shopping mall and buying us jackets, my dad had us jump into a garbage bin behind the mall and go dumpster diving on a winter jacket. And that was our jacket. My dad did not believe on buying new things. My dad kind of moped around at the house, never really did anything. He would sometimes drive Toyota cars from one dealership to the other, just to get away from the house, I think. Most of the time we went out, chop woods, anything that could be burned. My dad was big into wood stoves and wood heaters, wood, fireplace. He did not like the idea of being part of the grid, somewhat. So by the time 1984, 83, 84, let's see, 7, 8, and a little bit of 9th grade, I probably stayed in Sheboygan for about 3 years, less than 3 years. By the time 1983 and 84 came around, President Ferdinand Marcos was ousted. Now, the first one was Benigno Aquino got assassinated in the airplane, which caused the people in the Philippines to revolt, and they called it the world's first people power. And but he was still the president when my family and I went home. I remember that. When we went home, it was the beginning of the people power revolution. Anyway, months and months came by before we came home. My dad rented a 40-foot container and filled it up with many tools and useful things, such as washing machines and lawnmowers and stereos, and among other things. Notably, two items stands out that will be important to this story. I remember that container was parked right there off the street, and my brother and my dad would load up this container. As I said, there are two very important components that was loaded up in this container. One was an 18-foot satellite dish. Nobody had a private satellite dish in the Philippines. Two, my dad also bought the second item. My dad bought a Tomcat ultralight. It was kind of a weird configuration. The wing was in the back. There was a canard. You straddled onto an aluminum tubing. It had a Cuyuna 2-cycle engine in back. He bought that for himself. So anyway, fast forward, we go home. By then, LP is one of the prominent, person in Cagayan de Oro City. He also owned a very successful burger shop called Sesame Street. But he also was the very first electronics repair shop in the whole Mindanao. And people from around the Philippines or Mindanao would flock to him and have their TVs and everything electronics repaired. Now my dad, as I mentioned, bought a satellite dish, and that was intended to be given to his best friend LP. And by this time, Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law. All the news in the Philippines were controlled, and only the government news approved media was allowed to stay on air or be reported. LP, as a genius as he is, he started putting up this satellite dish, and he would record the news. Imagine this, get this, hold on to shorts. He would listen in to CBS, ABC, and CNN. And that was when CNN was they were a very worthy news organization. And from what I understand, I gotta back up here. When we arrived in the Philippines, the container arrived a few weeks later, right? And it was the container was shipped to LP because he knew all the politicians and all the customs, and he had a lot of juice as far as the government is concerned. And so instead of having the container opened up at the port, he had it set up where the container would be parked outside of our house, and that's where the customs would do their customs business. And I was in charge of explaining to what certain items was, how much they were worth. And so in this case, I will mention the satellite dish. They asked me what it was, and you have to realize that satellite dish was not heard. Most people didn't know what a satellite dish was in the Philippines. So I said, well, because if you disassemble a satellite dish, they pile up into one pile, and it's kind of like a pie. But if you, as I said, this is a garden umbrella. If you assemble it, it becomes an umbrella, and it's you can use it in a swimming pool or in your garden. So, how much is that worth? Oh, so. When it comes to the electronic receiver for the satellite, well, it was a stereo worth so. How about the what's this little thing with propellers in it? Oh, that's just a air-powered go-kart. That's just my project. Listening to myself saying that right now, it makes me feel very, very guilty. But that's how we got through the customs. I was in charge of talking to the customs, what they were, and all that. So back to the story as far as the news. From what I have understood later on, was LP would record CNN and all the news from the U.S. that most people in the Philippines were not able to access to, and they would fly the tape, somehow get the tape to Manila to the right people, and so they can hear the news. So in a small way, from what I've heard, that little 18-foot satellite dish was part of the Philippine history. Imagine that. And that's how people revolted and got their news, and how they managed their strikes, and that's how they ousted Marcos. Oh boy, look at the time. I think I went over. We'll have to continue this some other time. Thank you for watching. As always, have a good and godly day. Peace.